Started with a laugh. You know, the type sharp, quick, gone before you're sure you really heard it. I was in the basement of my buddy Eric's house, flipping through the creaky old Ouija board we'd found in a trunk labeled Grandma Ruth's Memories. Eric thought it was hilarious. He's the type who'd scare himself and everyone around him just for kicks. "Come on, man," he nudged me, his grin practically cutting his face in half. "You scared?" I wasn't scared, not at first. Just uneasy. The board smelled like dust and time, with yellowed edges that seemed too brittle to touch. But the planchette? That thing was smooth, almost polished, like someone had been using it regularly. "Let's get it over with," I muttered. I wanted to sound bored, but I felt the weight of the basement pressing down, like the air was a bit too thick. The light bulb overhead flickered, probably just Eric's crappy wiring. Still, it didn't help. Eric lit some candles, because why not add to the whole cliché, right? And we sat down. He placed his hands on the planchette and gave me an exaggerated hurry-up look. I rolled my eyes and did the same. The first question was dumb, as they always are. Is there a spirit here with us? For a moment, nothing happened. I could hear the faint hum of the fridge upstairs, the muffled sound of cars outside. Then, ever so slowly, the planchette moved. I swear to God, I didn't do it. I looked at Eric, expecting him to burst out laughing, but he wasn't. His grin was gone, replaced by this confused frown. The planchette slid to yes. I stared at Eric. "All right, knock it off," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Dude, that wasn't me," he said, holding his hands up for a second to prove his innocence before putting them back on the planchette. I wanted to laugh, tell him he sucked at pranks, but there was something in his face, a tightness around his mouth, a flicker of unease in his eyes, that stopped me. "Okay," I muttered, more to myself than him. "Let's keep going." Eric leaned in, his voice quieter now. "What's your name?" For a long moment, the board didn't move. The only sound was the flickering of one of the candles. Then, ever so slowly, the planchette began to slide again. It stopped on M. Then R. "Mark," Eric said, his tone half a whisper, half a question. The planchette didn't stop. "Why, Mary." I felt my stomach tighten. "Mary who?" This time, the planchette didn't move immediately. It sat there, trembling slightly under our fingertips. Then it slid again. R-U-T-H. Mary Ruth. Eric's voice cracked. The candles flickered, and I swear, I felt the temperature in the room drop. "My grandma's name was Ruth," Eric said. His voice was barely audible. But she's not Mary Ruth. She was just Ruth. I think." "You think?" I hissed. "I don't know. She never talked about her family. Okay?" He was panicking now, his hands pulling away from the planchette. "No, keep your hands on it," I snapped. "You're not supposed to break the connection." He hesitated, then reluctantly placed his fingers back. "What do we do now?" I swallowed hard. "Ask her what she wants." Eric shot me a look, but he asked the question. "What do you want?" The planchette moved so quickly this time that we both flinched. It spelled out the word like it couldn't wait to tell us. "Y-O-U." For a second, neither of us moved. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. "What the hell does that mean?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know, man," I whispered, but deep down, I had a horrible feeling we were about to find out. Before we could say anything else, the planchette began moving again. Faster this time, like the board itself was alive. It spelled another word, L-O-O-K. "Look," I said aloud. "Look where?" Then it stopped. The planchette sat dead still for half a beat before it jerked again, sliding to the corner of the board where the word goodbye was etched in faded letters. Eric and I just stared at each other, waiting for something else to happen. The silence was deafening. Then, a faint noise broke it, the sound of footsteps. Upstairs. Eric's head whipped around toward the staircase. "Dude, did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "Is someone else here?" "No," he hissed. "It's just us. My parents are out of town." Nobody else has a key. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor directly above us. Sounded like boots. Heavy ones. Maybe it's a raccoon or something? I offered, though I didn't even believe myself. Raccoons didn't wear boots. Man, I don't have raccoons in my house, Eric whispered harshly. Before we could decide what to do, the footsteps stopped. The next sound chilled me to my core. A slow, deliberate knock on the basement door. Knock, knock, knock. Eric and I stared at the door, frozen. Neither of us could move, let alone breathe. Who's there? Eric finally managed to call out, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The knocking came again, 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder. Dude, what the hell do we do? Eric hissed, his face pale. I shook my head, my mind racing. We end it, I stammered. The board. You have to say goodbye. What? You're supposed to say goodbye. If you don't, you leave the door open for. Before I could finish, the basement door handle began to turn. The handle turned slowly, creaking like it hadn't been used in years. Eric scrambled backward, nearly knocking over the candles. Say goodbye, I shouted, my voice cracking. Eric grabbed the planchette, his hands shaking so badly I thought he might drop it. Goodbye, 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 he shouted over and over, slamming the planchette down on the word. But nothing happened. The handle stopped turning, and for a moment, everything went silent again. No footsteps, no knocking, just the sound of our ragged breathing and the faint flicker of the candle flames. And then boom, the door slammed open so hard it hit the wall, the crash echoing through the basement. The air felt heavier, colder, like something unseen had rushed into the room. I instinctively grabbed Eric's arm, yanking him to his feet. We need to get out of here. But what about the board? He shouted, his voice filled with panic. Screw the board, I yelled, dragging him toward the stairs. But before we could take more than a step, the candles all went out at once. The room plunged into darkness, and a sound filled the air. A low, guttural growl, like something massive was crouched just out of sight. Eric screamed, and I wasn't far behind. I fumbled in the dark, trying to find my phone, anything to light the way. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the railing, and I yanked Eric toward the stairs. As we scrambled upward, the growling grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the concrete floor. It was following us. Go, go, go! I screamed, practically shoving Eric up the stairs. We burst into the kitchen, slamming the door behind us and locking it. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle for good measure. What the hell was that? Eric gasped, doubling over as he tried to catch his breath. I don't know, I yelled. But I told you this was a bad idea. A sudden thud against the basement door made us both jump. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't knocking this time. Whatever was on the other side was slamming into the door, harder and harder with each hit. The chair under the handle rattled, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. We need to get out of here, I said, grabbing Eric by the arm again. But, no buts, Eric. Let's go. We bolted out the front door and into the cold night air. Neither of us stopped running until we were halfway down the block. When we finally turned back, Eric's house stood eerily quiet. The lights in the basement were still out, but one window glowed faintly, a flickering light like a candle. I thought they all went out, Eric whispered. They did, I said, my voice barely audible. We stood there, staring at the house, too scared to go back, too confused to leave entirely. And then, in the faint glow of that basement window, I swear I saw a shadow, a figure standing perfectly still, watching us. But it wasn't just watching. It was waving. Eric and I didn't go back to his house that night. Hell, we didn't go back for days. We crashed at my place, barely sleeping, jumping at every creak and shadow. Neither of us said it, but we were both terrified that whatever we'd let in hadn't stayed behind. On the third night, Eric's phone rang at 2:13 a.m. The sound jolted us awake, and for a moment, We just stared at each other. His phone was on the table between us, its screen glowing eerily in the dark. The caller ID said unknown. "Don't answer it," I whispered. Eric hesitated, but then the phone stopped ringing. Relief washed over me until it started again. Same number, same unknown. This time, Eric picked it up, his hand trembling. Hello? At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, just like the one from the basement. Eric threw the phone like it had burned him, and it clattered to the floor. The call ended on its own, the screen going dark. "We need to fix this," he said, his voice shaking. "Fix what?" I snapped. "You think there's some magical fix for summoning God knows what into your house?" He glared at me. "You're the one who told me not to break the connection. I didn't tell you to screw around with a cursed Ouija board." The argument fizzled out quickly because, deep down, we both knew there was no point in blaming each other. What mattered was figuring out how to stop whatever this was. "Maybe we need to go back," Eric said reluctantly. I stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Back to your house? Are you insane?" "We left the board there," he said. "Isn't that what started this? If we don't close it properly, maybe it's just open." The thought of going back made my skin crawl, but I couldn't argue with his logic. If there was even a chance we could end this nightmare, we had to try. The next night, we drove back to Eric's house. It was dead quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world itself is holding its breath. The basement door was still closed, the chair we'd wedged under the handle lying on its side. "Let's just grab the board and get out," I whispered. Eric nodded, flipping on the flashlight on his phone. The basement was even worse than I remembered. It was freezing and the air felt wrong, heavy, stifling. The Ouija board was still on the floor where we'd left it, the planchette sitting dead center. Eric crouched down, his hands shaking as he picked it up. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "Let's end this." He placed his hands on the planchette, and I did the same. "Who are you?" Eric asked. The planchette didn't move. "What do you want?" He tried again. "Nothing. Maybe it's gone," I whispered, the words feeling hollow. But then the planchette began to slide. H-E-L-P. "Help," Eric frowned. "What does that mean?" The planchette jerked again, faster this time, like whatever was using it was desperate. H-I-M. "Help him?" Eric's voice cracked. Who are we supposed to help?" Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Both of us froze, and then we heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming down the stairs. "Say goodbye," I whispered, my voice trembling. Eric's hands were glued to the board, his eyes wide with fear. "Say it," I shouted. Eric slammed the planchette to goodbye. The air shifted instantly, the heaviness lifted, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But the footsteps didn't stop. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and in the dim glow of Eric's flashlight, we saw it. A figure, tall, shadowy, completely featureless, but its presence was suffocating. It didn't move toward us, it just stood there, watching. Eric grabbed the board and threw it across the room. "What do you want?" he screamed. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one long, shadowy arm and pointed at Eric. The figure's shadowy hand stayed extended, pointing directly at Eric. He froze, his breathing so loud and ragged I thought he might pass out. What do you want from me?" Eric stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him. Then, slowly, it pointed downward, toward the floor. I glanced at where it was pointing and saw something I hadn't noticed before. The planchette, which Eric had thrown across the room, was lying upside down. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. Eric didn't answer. Instead, he knelt down and flipped the planchette over. Carved into the underside, in jagged letters that looked like they'd been scratched there with a knife, was one word: pay. Eric stared at it, his face pale. "Pay? Pay what?" The figure didn't respond. It simply lowered its arm and began to dissolve, its edges fraying and unraveling like smoke caught in a breeze. Within seconds, it was gone. We sat there in stunned silence, the room eerily still. Then, all at once, the candles relit themselves, their flames steady and unnaturally bright. "I think it's over," Eric said finally, his voice trembling. I wanted to believe him, but something about the word pay stuck with me. Whatever had been in that basement, whatever we had summoned, didn't feel like it was done with us. Weeks passed. Eric and I stopped talking about that night. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, to convince ourselves that whatever had been unleashed was gone. But it wasn't. One night, I got a call from Eric. His voice was frantic, his words tumbling over each other. "It's happening again," he said. "What? What's happening?" "The board. I don't have it anymore. But things are moving in my house. Doors slamming, lights flickering. And last night, I heard footsteps." My stomach turned. "Did you say goodbye to the board?" "I did," he snapped. "I said goodbye. I followed all the rules." "Then it's not the board," I said, my voice low. "It's you. You're the one it wants." The line went dead. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't heard from Eric since. His house is empty now. His parents came back to find it abandoned. His phone left on the kitchen counter. The police think he skipped town, but I know better. The thing we summoned never left. It was waiting, watching, and when it was ready, it came for him. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that shadowy figure. The way it pointed at Eric, the way it seemed so focused on him. Then I remember that it had been my idea to stay and finish the session. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of my room, I feel like I'm being watched too. The worst part? Every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., my phone rings. The caller ID says unknown. I don't answer. Not anymore.